The small town of Pineview, Texas was known for many things: its charming streets, its local diners, and of course, its food. But there was one place that stood above all others when it came to culinary fame: Barlow's Grill. Owned by the renowned chef Marcus Barlow, the restaurant was the talk of the town. His name was synonymous with exquisite taste, his dishes regularly featured in food magazines, and his restaurant had earned multiple prestigious awards. People came from miles around just to catch a glimpse of the master chef at work. However, there was a side to Marcus Barlow that no one in Pineview knew about, a dark, twisted secret that was about to unravel in the most horrifying way. It started with the disappearance of his wife, Laura Barlow. Laura had been married to Marcus for 15 years. She was beautiful, smart, and well-liked by everyone who knew her. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Marcus, the successful chef, and Laura, his charming and supportive wife. But as the weeks passed after Laura's disappearance, the cracks in the perfect facade began to show. At first, no one thought much of it. People assumed Laura had just gone away on a trip, or perhaps decided to take some time off to recharge. It wasn't unusual for someone with a high-profile spouse to retreat from the limelight now and then. But as the days turned into weeks, and Marcus didn't make any public statements or appear concerned, people began to wonder. Was Laura truly gone? Or was something more sinister at play? Detective Elena Martinez had seen plenty of strange cases in her 20 years of service. But the case of Laura Barlow's disappearance seemed different. The quiet town of Pineview wasn't used to scandal. When she was assigned to investigate, she approached it with the professionalism she had honed over the years. But even she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. It wasn't just the lack of effort Marcus had shown in trying to locate his wife. It was the way he carried himself. He was too calm, too detached from the situation. When the police came to speak with him, he didn't seem concerned or upset. Instead, he greeted them with a practiced smile and a cup of his signature coffee, offering little in the way of helpful information. "I'm sure Laura just needed a break," Marcus had said to Detective Martinez when she arrived at his restaurant to discuss the matter. "She's always been the more private one. It's not unusual for her to disappear for a few days, especially when things are getting busy around here." Detective Martinez wasn't convinced. She'd spent years reading people, and she could tell when someone was hiding something. There was no panic in Marcus's eyes, no genuine worry, just a calm demeanor that made her question everything she thought she knew about the couple. Days passed, and the investigation into Laura Barlow's disappearance grew colder. The more Detective Martinez dug into Marcus's life, the more unsettling things became. She spoke to friends and family members of Laura's, but no one had heard from her in weeks. Laura's social media accounts showed no signs of life. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail. It was as though she had vanished without a trace. Then one evening, as Detective Martinez was leaving her office, she received a call from one of the officers at the scene. "Detective, you need to come to the Barlow residence right away. We found something." When she arrived at the Barlow residence, she was greeted by the officer who had called her. They led her into the kitchen, where the smell of something unfamiliar lingered in the air. The officer looked at her with a mix of apprehension and grim determination. "We found something in the freezer," he said, his voice tight. "We thought it was worth checking out." As they opened the freezer, Detective Martinez's heart dropped. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were several large cuts of meat, fresh, raw, and unnervingly familiar. They resembled human flesh. The officer immediately went to work securing the scene and tagging the evidence. But the chilling thought that ran through Martinez's mind was undeniable. What was Marcus Barlow hiding? Later that night, as Detective Martinez and her team examined the meat more closely, they confirmed what she had feared. The flesh was human, and there was no denying it. Marcus Barlow was involved in something much darker than anyone had imagined. His wife Laura was gone, and the meat in that freezer was a grim testament to what had happened to her. Sickened and determined to uncover the truth, Detective Martinez launched a full investigation into Marcus Barlow's life and work. The more she dug, the more disturbing the evidence became. Barlow's reputation as a top chef had been carefully cultivated over the years, but his obsession with meat was taking on a more sinister tone. He had been sourcing meat from places with questionable origins, and there were whispers of rumors about his involvement with shady individuals in the culinary world. The case was now officially a murder investigation. The town of Pineview, once proud of its culinary gem, was rocked by the truth. Marcus Barlow had killed his wife and used her body as an ingredient for his sinister and twisted creations. But the question remained, why? Detective Elena Martinez sat alone in her office late that night, the room illuminated only by the dim light of her desk lamp. Her mind kept replaying the grisly discovery of the human meat in Marcus Barlow's freezer, the sickening realization that Laura Barlow had met an unimaginable fate. The fact that Marcus was a well-known, well-respected chef only made it all the more disturbing. It wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of trust, of the art of cooking, and of everything his restaurant had come to represent. The investigation was moving fast now, and though it was difficult to process, Martinez couldn't let herself get lost in the horror of it. There was a bigger question to solve. Why? Why had Marcus killed his wife? Why had he used her body as part of his cooking? The following day, Detective Martinez sat down with the team to go over the evidence they had gathered. The freezer had been secured and sent to the lab for further analysis. The flesh had already been confirmed to be human, and the blood samples had been taken from the scene to confirm that they matched Laura Barlow's DNA. The next step was clear. They needed to speak to Marcus. He was still being held in police custody, and Martinez knew it was time for a confrontation. No more polite questions. No more carefully constructed interviews. Marcus Barlow was going to face the truth of what he had done. When Martinez walked into the interrogation room, Marcus was sitting there, as composed as ever. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, his posture straight, but there was something different in his eyes. The usual calm was gone, replaced by a glimmer of something darker, something cold. "Mr. Barlow," Martinez began, taking a seat across from him, "we found the evidence. We know what happened to your wife." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, his lips curling slightly. "I know you think you have all the answers, Detective," he said slowly, his voice flat, "but you have no idea what you're dealing with." Martinez leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You killed her, Marcus. You murdered your wife, and you used her body for your twisted culinary experiments. What I want to know is why." Marcus's expression didn't change. "I don't expect you to understand," he said. "You're just like the rest of them. You see a piece of meat and you think you understand its value, but you have no idea what true culinary art is. No one does. I've spent my entire life perfecting my craft, creating dishes that make people feel something. But this is the ultimate expression of my art." Martinez's stomach turned. "You're saying killing your wife was some kind of artistic endeavor?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "People eat things every day without thinking about where it comes from, what it really is. I wanted to show them. I wanted to force them to understand. I needed her. Laura, she had become a barrier between me and my work. She didn't understand me, not fully. She couldn't accept what I was doing. I had to show her the truth." Martinez struggled to contain her anger, but she kept her voice calm. "So you killed her because she threatened to expose you, because she was going to ruin everything you had worked for?" A flicker of something crossed Marcus's face. Perhaps guilt, perhaps recognition of the reality of his actions. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by a mask of cold indifference. She didn't understand. She wasn't capable of understanding. She was weak, and weak people get in the way. Martinez had heard enough. She stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "You are a monster, Marcus. You took everything from her, and for what? To prove a point? To feed your ego?" Marcus didn't answer. He just sat there, his eyes empty. He had confessed in his own way, and there was no doubt left. But it was still hard for Martinez to comprehend what she had just heard. How could someone, anyone, justify such an atrocity? As she left the interrogation room, her mind was reeling. The investigation had taken a dark turn, but now they had a confession, even if it was twisted. Marcus Barlow had murdered his wife because she stood in the way of his obsession. He had killed her and used her body as a grotesque form of artistic expression. The days following Marcus's confession were filled with a flurry of activity. The police department had issued a public statement about Laura Barlow's death, and Marcus was charged with first-degree murder. The case was gaining attention from all over the state, and it wasn't long before the media began to pick up on the grisly details of the murder. Detective Martinez, though, remained focused on the case. She knew that the arrest was only the beginning. There were still too many questions left unanswered. How had Marcus been able to get away with his twisted actions for so long? How had he kept his secret hidden, even in a town that was small enough for people to know everything about each other? The more Martinez thought about it, the more she realized that there was something bigger at play. Marcus Barlow had been a celebrated chef, beloved by the town, praised for his talent. But behind the accolades and the fame, there had been something darker brewing. There had been a man who had learned to manipulate those around him, to use his charm and his skill to disguise the monster he had become. Over the next few days, Martinez and her team continued to investigate Marcus's background. They spoke with former employees of Barlow's Grill, as well as anyone who might have known him from his early days in the culinary world. What they discovered was even more disturbing than they had imagined. Marcus had been involved in a string of questionable business dealings over the years. Suppliers who had gone missing, customers who had complained about the quality of the food, and even reports from former employees who had hinted at a strange, almost cult-like atmosphere at the restaurant. People had spoken in hushed tones about Marcus's special recipes, but no one had ever dared to ask too many questions. It became clear that Marcus had been operating under the radar for a long time, using his restaurant and his culinary fame to cover up his criminal activities. His marriage to Laura had been the last obstacle standing between him and his twisted ambitions. The final break in the case came when Martinez discovered a hidden room in the basement of Barlow's Grill. It was dark, cold, and sterile, and it was filled with shelves of strange jars, bottles, and other items. There were also more photographs of people, their faces obscured by cuts of meat. It was as though Marcus had been keeping a record of his victims, a gruesome archive of his twisted culinary pursuits. One photograph in particular stood out. It was a picture of Marcus and Laura, taken in the early days of their marriage. But in the background, barely visible, was a figure, a person who seemed to be standing in the shadows, watching them. The person's face was obscured by darkness, but Martinez knew immediately that this was the key to unlocking the full extent of Marcus's crimes. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Marcus Barlow had been living a double life, one that he had managed to keep hidden behind his fame as a chef. But now, with the truth exposed, the town of Pineview was left to grapple with the horror of what had been happening under their noses. The reputation of Barlow's Grill was forever tarnished, and Marcus would never again be able to hide behind his culinary genius. Detective Martinez stood at the edge of the investigation, watching as Marcus Barlow was escorted out of his restaurant for the last time. There would be no redemption for him, no more accolades for his art. What remained was the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth of a man who had taken everything, even the life of his wife, to feed his twisted obsession. And for Detective Martinez, that was all that mattered. The small town of Pineview, Texas, was still in shock after the murder of Laura Barlow and the grisly revelation that her husband, the beloved chef Marcus Barlow, was responsible. The news had spread like wildfire, leaving the community divided between disbelief and horror. How could someone so admired, so well known for his culinary expertise, be capable of such a heinous crime? Detective Elena Martinez had been working tirelessly, but the case was far from over. Marcus had confessed, but that didn't explain everything. There were still too many questions about his motives, his history, and how he had managed to conceal his actions for so long. Martinez couldn't rest until she uncovered the full extent of Marcus's dark secret. The first thing Martinez did was revisit Barlow's Grill, now a crime scene under tight police watch. The restaurant, once a bustling center of culinary excellence, now stood eerily silent. It was as if the walls themselves knew the horrors that had taken place within. The staff who worked there were gone, and the restaurant was locked down, but there were still records to examine, and Martinez wasn't ready to walk away just yet. As she stepped inside the dimly lit dining room, The unmistakable smell of aged wood and spices lingered in the air. The tables were neatly arranged, as if awaiting customers who would never come. It felt unsettlingly normal, but underneath the surface, Martinez could sense the darkness. The place had once been Marcus Barlow's domain, his empire built on fame, but now it felt like a tomb. Martinez moved quickly, heading toward the back office. She knew this was where the heart of the investigation lay. There had to be something here, something that could explain how Marcus had hidden his gruesome secret from the public eye. She sat down at the desk and began sifting through papers, staff schedules, supplier invoices, and receipts. But it was a small, leather-bound journal that caught her attention. The journal had been tucked away in the back drawer, as though Marcus had gone to great lengths to hide it. The moment Martinez opened the journal, she knew she had found something important. The pages were filled with notes, recipes, and detailed accounts of meals Marcus had prepared. But what made her stop were the entries near the back. They seemed more personal, more erratic. As she read the lines, a chilling picture began to form in her mind. The journal detailed Marcus's growing obsession with the human body, his belief that food was more than just sustenance. It was art, a form of expression. There were references to meals made with unusual ingredients, some of which Martinez recognized as cuts of meat that had come from sources that couldn't be traced. But what disturbed her most were the final entries. Laura is too weak to understand. She doesn't appreciate the art I create. She's getting in the way of my masterpiece. She'll be part of the meal tonight. As Martinez read the chilling words, her breath caught in her throat. It was clear now. Marcus hadn't just killed Laura to silence her. He had killed her as part of his twisted desire to elevate his cooking into something darker, something no one could comprehend. He had seen her death as the culmination of his work, a way to prove that he was more than just a chef. He was an artist, capable of creating the ultimate dish. Martinez carefully closed the journal, her stomach turning. She had enough to move forward, but the full extent of Marcus's depravity was still beyond comprehension. There was no denying that Marcus had planned Laura's death, and that he had done so with the cold detachment of someone who believed his actions were justified. The next day, Detective Martinez met with the medical examiner to review the autopsy report. The details of Laura's death were even more horrifying than she had anticipated. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but what disturbed her most was the fact that there was evidence of human flesh being consumed post-mortem. The toxicology report confirmed traces of certain spices and unusual compounds that matched ingredients commonly used in Marcus's dishes. They were part of his meal, the medical examiner had said quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. He didn't just kill her, he used her body as an ingredient for his so-called art. Martinez felt a wave of revulsion. The entire town had been unknowingly eating human flesh, thinking it was just another culinary creation from Marcus Barlow's legendary kitchen. She thought back to the reports of strange incidents, whispers from people who had attended Marcus's dinners, where guests had marveled at his unique flavors. No one had ever questioned where the meat came from, and now it was all too clear. The investigation was beginning to take its toll on Martinez. It was one thing to solve a murder, but this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. Marcus Barlow had crossed a line that most people couldn't even fathom. His actions had defied the very essence of humanity, reducing his wife's life to nothing more than an ingredient for his twisted experiments. But the case was far from over. Martinez had to uncover how far Marcus's actions had gone. Had he killed before? Had there been other victims? She knew she couldn't rest until she found every last piece of the puzzle. That night, she went through the restaurant's old files again, this time focusing on the staff that had worked with Marcus. There were several names that stood out, employees who had left the restaurant under mysterious circumstances or had given vague reports about feeling uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior. She decided to speak with them. Her first stop was with an ex-chef who had worked under Marcus for years. He was hesitant at first, but eventually opened up after Martinez explained the seriousness of the investigation. He was obsessed with meat, the ex-chef said, his voice shaking. Not just any meat, though. He always wanted the finest cuts. I know he had connections with people who could get him anything, but there was something off about it. Sometimes the orders were strange. The shipments, They came from places I didn't know. Was there ever anything odd about the dishes you prepared? Martinez asked, leaning in. The chef paused, looking down at his hands. There were nights when he'd ask me to prepare certain dishes, and I didn't know where the meat came from. But it was his restaurant, his rules. He'd say, trust me, you'll never taste anything like it. He wasn't just feeding people. He was feeding an idea, a vision. Martinez made a mental note to dig deeper into Marcus's connections. This wasn't just about one murder. It was about the influence he had over those around him, the way he had warped the culinary world into his own dark playground. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews and evidence gathering. Martinez spoke to more former employees, uncovered strange financial transactions tied to off-the-books purchases, and tracked down the suppliers who had been providing Marcus with untraceable cuts of meat. Everything pointed back to one conclusion. Marcus Barlow had been living a double life, using his restaurant to hide his dark desires. But then, something unexpected happened. Late one evening, Martinez received a phone call from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, but the message was clear. There's more than one victim, the caller said, his voice trembling with fear. Marcus didn't just kill his wife. He's been doing this for years. You need to look into the missing persons reports from the last decade. They all have one thing in common. They were all regulars at Barlow's Grill. Martinez's blood ran cold. This was the break she had been waiting for. She immediately pulled up the missing persons database and began scanning the reports. The tipster's words were chillingly accurate. There were several missing persons cases, people who had been known to frequent Barlow's Grill regularly, who had disappeared without a trace. Now Martinez knew she was dealing with something much bigger. Marcus Barlow hadn't just killed his wife. He had been hiding his murderous ways behind the mask of a successful chef for years. The truth was out there, and it was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The case had just taken a dark turn, and now it was up to Martinez to bring every last piece of this twisted puzzle to light. The tip from the anonymous caller had sent Detective Elena Martinez down a rabbit hole she hadn't anticipated. Marcus Barlow, the acclaimed chef with a spotless public reputation, had been hiding a gruesome secret for years. His wife's death, though tragic and horrific in its own right, was only the tip of the iceberg. According to the tipster, there were more victims, many more. All of them had frequented Barlow's Grill, all of them had vanished, and now Martinez had to figure out how many people Marcus Barlow had truly killed. As the rain pounded against her office window, Martinez pored over the missing persons reports. She knew she couldn't let the pressure of this case distract her. The scale of what Marcus had done was mind-boggling, but she had a responsibility to uncover the truth for the victims, for their families, and for the community that had been unknowingly fed by a monster. The first thing Martinez did was request the missing persons reports. She knew that there had to be a connection between the people who had disappeared over the years and the strange, untraceable shipments of meat that Barlow had been receiving at his restaurant. The more she examined the files, the clearer the pattern became. There were at least 5 reports of missing individuals from the past decade, and all of them were linked to Barlow's Grill. Each missing person had been a regular at the restaurant. Some had dined there alone, others with friends or family. But the common thread was unmistakable. They had all visited Barlow's Grill, and none of them had been seen again after their last meal. Martinez knew she had to dig deeper. She spoke to family members and friends of the missing individuals, but the interviews yielded few leads. Most people remembered the missing persons fondly. Some had even been loyal patrons of the restaurant for years. None of them had any inkling that they were at risk when they sat down for their last meal. It seemed that Marcus had been much more careful than anyone had realized. As she worked through the evidence, Martinez focused her attention on the restaurant's kitchen staff. It was clear that Marcus Barlow had operated with a great deal of secrecy, but someone had to have known something. Surely one of his employees had seen something strange, something that didn't add up. And then, after another round of interviews with former staff members, she found her first real breakthrough. Marla Hughes, a former waitress at Barlow's Grill, was the first to speak openly. She had worked at the restaurant for nearly 3 years before quitting abruptly just 6 months ago. When Martinez visited her at her home, Marla was hesitant at first, but the detective's persistence eventually broke through her guarded exterior. He wasn't just a chef, you know, Marla whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if she feared someone was listening. Marcus was obsessed. He'd talk about his food like it was sacred, like it wasn't just for eating, but for feeling something. He would make these special dishes for regulars, and he wouldn't even let the kitchen staff know what was in them. He'd handle the meat himself. No one ever questioned it because he was Marcus Barlow. But I saw things. Martinez leaned forward. What did you see, Marla? Marla's face grew pale, and she took a deep breath. There were nights when Marcus would pull someone aside. One time I saw him talking to this older man, one of the regulars. I didn't think anything of it at first, but the next night, that man was gone. No one ever mentioned it, but I saw Marcus with a strange look on his face when he came into the kitchen that night. He was holding a bag, a heavy bag. Samantha's mind raced. This was it. She was starting to piece it together. What was in the bag, Marla? Marla shook her head. I don't know, but I saw him open it in the back room. It was some kind of meat wrapped up in butcher's paper. He looked at it like it was a treasure, like he just won a prize. And I swear there was something wrong with the smell. It wasn't like anything I'd ever smelled before. Martinez's pulse quickened. It was becoming clear that Marcus had been using his restaurant to carry out these grisly acts for years. But what was more disturbing was that he had apparently been able to hide it in plain sight, under the guise of culinary innovation. How many had he killed? How many people had he fed, unknowingly, parts of their own community? Martinez's next step was to connect the dots between Marcus's unusual meat shipments and the missing persons. She began to go through the restaurant's delivery logs, and after hours of sifting through paperwork, she found something troubling. An offshore company that had been providing Marcus with meat for years. The shipments were always marked as premium cuts, but the company had no listed address and no traceable contact information. Using her connections at the police department, Martinez was able to track down the owner of the company. It was a small-time businessman who had no idea where his meat came from. He just knew that Marcus paid well, and that's all he cared about. Martinez was able to gather more information about the supplier and learned that the meat came from various unregulated sources, some of which were directly linked to black market trafficking. This revelation only added to the growing suspicion that Marcus's special meat was more than just beef or pork. It was human flesh. The deeper Martinez dug, the more she uncovered about Marcus's involvement in a broader network of criminal activity. He wasn't just a murderer, he was part of a much larger system of illicit trade, one that operated under the radar of the law and used his fame as a cover. People who frequented Barlow's Grill had unknowingly become victims of an organized underground operation that had been taking place for years. As Martinez followed the trail, she found links to other victims. One of the missing persons, a young woman named Sarah Jennings, had been seen leaving the restaurant with Marcus just a few weeks before she disappeared. She had been dating one of the local delivery drivers who had witnessed a strange interaction between Sarah and Marcus that night. Sarah had been promised a special dinner, one that she couldn't refuse, and after that, no one had seen her again. In the coming weeks, Martinez continued to uncover more evidence. It wasn't just the butchered bodies. It was the trail of human lives that had been stolen for the sake of a twisted, warped vision. Marcus Barlow had killed not only his wife, but countless others, using their remains to fuel his insatiable obsession with food. Martinez's determination to uncover the truth only grew as the case unraveled before her. But as she closed in on the truth, one thing was clear. Marcus was not working alone. There were others, people who had helped him, people who had turned a blind eye to the unspeakable horrors happening inside Barlow's Grill. One rainy afternoon, Martinez finally had the chance to confront Marcus once more. He had been brought in for questioning, his arrogance replaced by a cold indifference. When Martinez walked into the room, Marcus looked up at her with a faint smirk. "You think you've won, detective," he said, his voice calm. "You think you've unraveled all of my secrets, but you haven't even scratched the surface." Martinez took a seat across from him. "You've taken everything from these people, Marcus. You've destroyed lives. And for what? To make your twisted masterpiece?" Marcus's eyes darkened. They never understood the artistry of it. They never saw the beauty in what I was creating. They were just ingredients, and I was the chef. Samantha's stomach churned, but she held her ground. You killed them, and now you'll pay the price. Marcus Barlow's trial began, and the town of Pineview was left to grapple with the shocking truth about their once celebrated chef. His restaurant was closed, his name forever tainted by his horrific crimes. But for Detective Martinez, the case was far from over. There were still more victims to be found, more people who had fallen prey to Marcus's deadly culinary vision. As the investigation continued, Martinez vowed to bring every last person involved in Marcus Barlow's twisted world to justice. The trial of Marcus Barlow was one of the most shocking events Pineview had ever witnessed. The town had always prided itself on being quiet and peaceful, but now it was gripped by fear and curiosity. The former beloved chef, whose culinary creations had once been hailed as masterpieces, was now the subject of national attention for the brutal murder of his wife and a string of other gruesome killings. As the evidence against him mounted, more details about his twisted activities were revealed, sending shockwaves through the community. But while Marcus sat in the courtroom, his smirk fading, Detective Elena Martinez continued to piece together the web of horror he had spun. The trial, while public and disturbing, was only the beginning of a much larger investigation. What Marcus had done was not just a crime of passion, it was part of something deeper, something darker. And Martinez knew that if she wanted justice for the victims, she had to uncover everything. After the trial began, Martinez worked relentlessly to track down the people who had helped Marcus and to determine just how deep the conspiracy ran. While Marcus had taken full responsibility for his wife's murder, Martinez knew that the scale of his crimes was much larger than he had admitted. The more she dug, the more it became clear that Marcus's victims were not just local patrons of his restaurant. There were others, people whose disappearances stretched back years, and there were more people involved in the trafficking of human flesh than anyone could have imagined. The first breakthrough came when Martinez received a tip from a former employee at Barlow's Grill. The tipster, a man named Greg Campbell, had worked as a server for several years before quitting after witnessing several unusual interactions between Marcus and a few of the restaurant's more exclusive clientele. He had never thought much of it at the time, but the information he provided now was critical. Marcus would often talk about special orders, Greg explained, sitting nervously in Martinez's office. He'd go off about how the perfect cut of meat was an art form. He had this guy he'd always refer to, never by name, just the buyer. I didn't know what he meant by that, but it didn't sit right with me. Martinez sat forward, sensing that this was the lead she needed. Do you know who this buyer was? Did you ever meet him? Greg hesitated. I never met him, but I saw him once, at the restaurant. I didn't think much of it, but the guy was different. He had this look, like he was involved in something that wasn't right. And after that, Marcus started ordering even more obscure meats, things that I'd never seen before. I couldn't ask questions, but it felt wrong. This was the break Martinez had been looking for. She knew that Marcus had been using his restaurant as a front for something much darker than a culinary passion. But now she had to track down this buyer and learn just how far Marcus's network extended. A few days later, the investigation took another unsettling turn. Martinez was able to track down the name of the buyer through Greg's testimony, and with some help from the department's cyber division, they discovered that the buyer was a man named Ivan Kova, an international trafficker with a long history of operating on the black market. He had been involved in several high-profile cases involving human trafficking and illegal meat trade, but he had always managed to stay one step ahead of the law. Kova's connection to Marcus was now undeniable. It seemed that Marcus had been working with Kova for years, obtaining human flesh from his victims and preparing it for consumption by wealthy, unsuspecting clientele. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was part of a larger, organized operation, one that spanned multiple states and possibly even countries. Martinez knew she needed to move quickly. Even Kova had disappeared without a trace, and if he wasn't caught soon, there was no telling how many more lives he and Marcus could destroy. With the pressure mounting, Detective Martinez reached out to her colleagues in other states, asking for assistance in locating Kova. Her team also began to focus on tracking down other possible victims of Marcus and the trafficking ring, starting with a missing persons case in a nearby city. The victim had been last seen dining at Barlow's Grill, and the details matched a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow Marcus's career. As the investigation continued, it became evident that the human meat trade that Marcus had been involved in was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Barlow's Grill had served as a hub, but Kova's network reached into cities and towns across the United States. There were people missing, people who had become nothing more than commodities in this dark, unregulated world. Martinez found herself working long hours, poring over old case files, connecting the dots between missing persons and Marcus's clientele. She discovered that several of the missing individuals had been lured to the restaurant under false pretenses, promised extravagant meals and experiences. These people had been treated like prized animals, slaughtered, and then served to a paying audience. But the most shocking revelation came when Martinez uncovered a set of photos, each one showing a different person with Marcus in the kitchen. These weren't just customers. These were potential victims. Marcus had been keeping a detailed record of each special order, documenting the people he had targeted for his twisted meals. The breakthrough came when Martinez and her team tracked down an informant who had once worked with Ivan Kova. The informant, a former associate named Angela Green, had been hiding under an assumed identity but agreed to meet with Martinez after she was promised immunity. Angela was terrified, but she had vital information. They didn't just want the meat, Angela explained, her voice shaking. They wanted the thrill. They wanted to experience the ultimate meal, the kind that was forbidden. Marcus and Kova weren't just selling human flesh. They were selling an experience, a twisted form of exclusivity. People who could afford it were willing to pay anything to taste something forbidden. Angela's words confirmed Martinez's suspicions. This wasn't just about a man cooking human flesh to feed his ego. It was about an underground market where wealth, power, and depravity intersected. The rich were paying top dollar to dine on the ultimate taboo, and Marcus Barlow had been at the center of it all. With this new information, Martinez knew that time was running out. She had to act fast before Ivan Kova and the rest of the network slipped away once again. She gathered her team and coordinated with federal agencies to set up a sting operation aimed at capturing Kova and putting an end to the trafficking ring. As the operation unfolded, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Ivan Kova was finally captured in a small motel on the outskirts of Pineview, where he had been hiding under an alias. He was arrested and brought in for questioning, where he provided further details about the scale of the operation and the involvement of numerous high-profile individuals. Marcus Barlow, already in custody, faced additional charges related to human trafficking and organized crime. His trial was set to be a long and highly publicized affair, and Martinez knew it would be her final chance to bring him and the people who had enabled his crimes to justice. As the investigation wound down and the pieces fell into place, Pineview slowly began to recover from the shock. The town would never be the same, but the truth had been exposed. Marcus Barlow, once the face of culinary excellence, was now a symbol of the darkness that can hide behind the most polished facades. Detective Martinez sat in her office, reflecting on the case. The horror of it all still weighed on her, but she knew that she had done everything she could to uncover the truth. There were still more victims out there, but at least they had one less monster to fear. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Detective Elena Martinez stood in front of her desk, a mountain of case files stacked before her, each one containing the names and identities of people who had been swallowed into Marcus Barlow's dark network. The investigation had taken a disturbing turn, revealing connections to powerful figures from all corners of society. Businessmen, politicians, and even celebrities. People who had hidden behind their wealth and status while exploiting the vulnerable, all while being complicit in the trafficking of human flesh. She could feel the weight of it all, the responsibility, the pressure. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher. Marcus Barlow might have been the face of the operation, but Martinez knew that he was just one cog in a much larger and far-reaching machine. The people involved were not only dangerous, but deeply entrenched in a system that protected them at all costs. The investigation was no longer just about solving a single crime. It had become a fight for justice on an international scale. The names Richard Claiborne had provided were just the beginning, and as the days passed, Martinez's determination only grew stronger. But every step she took brought her closer to a chilling truth. The deeper she went, the more powerful the enemies she faced would become. A week after her meeting with Richard, Martinez was sitting in her office reviewing the last batch of intel they had gathered. The feds had tracked down a few of the names from Richard's list, but it wasn't enough. The network was far more organized and resilient than anyone had expected. As she flipped through the documents, one file caught her eye, something that hadn't been on her radar until now. It was a name she recognized: Elliot Grayson. Grayson was a high-profile politician with ties to a number of business ventures, and although his name had never come up in connection to Marcus Barlow before, something about it made Martinez pause. She dug deeper into his background, cross-referencing him with the names in the trafficking ring. That was when she found it. Grayson had attended Barlow's Grill several times over the years, often dining with influential business leaders from overseas. Her stomach churned. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Elliot Grayson was a key figure in the network. The next morning, Martinez arranged a meeting with her team. They were going to take a more aggressive approach. It was time to put pressure on the individuals involved in the operation, starting with Grayson. They had enough circumstantial evidence to question him, and Martinez knew that if they could break him, they might get closer to the rest of the ring. As she walked into the briefing room, she could feel the tension in the air. The team was ready. They were all in this together, and they all knew how dangerous the task ahead was. Martinez took a deep breath and began to speak. "We've got a lead on Elliot Grayson. He's connected to this network in more ways than we originally thought. He's been tied to several of the people we've already identified as buyers. It's time to take him down." The room fell silent for a moment before one of the agents spoke up. "You think he's going to crack under pressure? He's a politician. He's used to hiding things." Martinez nodded. "We won't know unless we try. We have enough evidence to get his attention. If we can get him talking, we might be able to unravel the rest of this operation." The team moved quickly, gathering intel on Grayson's daily routine and personal connections. He was well protected, and his political career had given him access to people who could shield him from scrutiny. But Martinez wasn't intimidated. She had spent too long in this world of lies and deceit, and she knew how to get to the truth. The following afternoon, Martinez and a few of her trusted team members showed up. At one of Grayson's private offices, the building was sleek, modern, and tucked away in one of the wealthier parts of the city. As they walked through the lobby, Martinez couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. She had come face to face with criminals before, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. When they reached his office, Grayson was there, sitting behind a polished desk, his eyes cold and calculating. He stood when they entered, a forced smile on his face. "Detective Martinez," he said, his voice smooth. "I assume this is about my recent involvement with Barlow's Grill?" Martinez didn't waste time. "We have reason to believe you're connected to a human trafficking operation involving Marcus Barlow. We have evidence of your ties to the network, and we know you've been dining with known criminals for years. It's time to answer some questions, Grayson." Grayson's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. Barlow's Grill was a place I visited, yes, but I was a customer. That's all." Martinez leaned in, her voice sharp. "A customer? Don't insult my intelligence. You know as well as I do that Barlow wasn't just serving food. You were involved, Elliot. You're part of something much bigger, and it's time you came clean." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "I have nothing to confess. This is just a baseless attack on my character." Martinez didn't flinch. "I don't think so. You've been dining on human flesh, using your power to cover up the crimes you've been involved in, and we know exactly what kind of men you've been feeding." The room grew tense, and for a moment it looked like Grayson might break. But instead he sat back down and chuckled darkly. "You think you have me cornered, detective. You're naive. People like me don't go down so easily." Martinez didn't back down. "You're wrong. People like you are the ones who always get caught in the end. And when they do, they take everyone else down with them." As the interrogation continued, Grayson's demeanor began to shift. He became less confident, his facade cracking as the weight of the evidence mounted. He tried to deny everything, but Martinez had done her homework. She had the connections, the photos, the testimonies. It was only a matter of time before he would have no choice but to confess. It was then that Grayson dropped the bombshell. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I didn't kill anyone, but I helped cover it up." Marcus Barlow wasn't working alone. He had backing. He had patrons, high-profile individuals, who helped him stay afloat, helped him operate in the shadows. The human trafficking, the illegal meat trade, it wasn't just for his personal gain. It was part of a bigger scheme, one that extended beyond Barlow's grill. "I helped him because I was promised something in return. Power." Martinez's mind raced. "Who else is involved?" Grayson paused, then looked at her, his eyes filled with cold resignation. "I can't tell you all of their names, but I'll tell you this. Marcus Barlow was just the beginning. The real power lies in those who are too rich and too untouchable to ever be caught." Grayson had cracked. Martinez knew that his confession would give them the leverage they needed to bring down the entire network. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. Later that night, Martinez reviewed the transcript of her interview with Grayson. His confession had been a game changer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. Grayson had hinted at a much larger operation, one that spanned beyond Marcus Barlow and his restaurant. There were people in power, hidden in plain sight, who had been enabling the crimes for years. As Martinez sat alone in her office, she realized that this case was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. But she couldn't stop now. The victims, both seen and unseen, needed justice. She stood up from her desk and walked toward the window, looking out over the darkened city. Pineview had changed forever, but so had she. The fight was far from over, and Martinez was more determined than ever to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The investigation into Marcus Barlow's network had escalated beyond anything Detective Elena Martinez could have imagined. What had begun as a search for the truth behind the murder of Laura Barlow had blossomed into a sprawling case that connected Marcus to a shadowy, dangerous web of wealthy patrons, international traffickers, and powerful figures who thought they could operate outside the law. Now, after months of relentless work, Martinez had a sense of the full scale of what she was dealing with. But the final showdown was approaching, and it was clear. The closer she got to the truth, the more perilous it became. The breaking point came when Martinez received another anonymous tip, this time through an encrypted message. It was from someone who claimed to know everything about the hidden players behind Marcus Barlow's operation. The tipster promised to reveal their names but insisted on meeting face-to-face. Martinez knew she couldn't pass this up. She coordinated with her team and arranged to meet the informant at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place no one would think to look. The entire team was on high alert. The last thing they needed was for the informant to be a trap set by one of the powerful figures protecting Marcus. But Martinez's instincts told her this was a lead they couldn't afford to ignore. As she arrived at the location, her heart raced. The sun had long since set, and the cold air stung her face. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Martinez stepped cautiously inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The only sound was the echo of her footsteps on the cement floor. Then from the shadows a figure stepped forward. The informant was a middle-aged man, his face lined with fear and anxiety. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Martinez didn't lower her guard. "Who are you?" The man hesitated before speaking. "My name's Michael Dune. I used to work for the syndicate. I helped facilitate some of the deals, but I was getting too scared, too disgusted. I know the names you need. I know who's behind everything." Martinez's pulse quickened. "Tell me everything." Dune quickly explained that the human trafficking and illegal meat trade had been operating under the guise of elite social circles, with high-ranking politicians, influential businessmen, and even international diplomats involved. The operation spanned across several countries, with Marcus Barlow as a key figure. But Marcus had never been the mastermind. He had been a tool used by more powerful people who remained hidden in the shadows. They used Marcus as a front, Dune explained. He was perfect, famous, admired, trusted. But he wasn't in charge. The real power is much higher up. They thought he was disposable, just a means to an end. Dune's words confirmed Martinez's worst fears. Marcus had been manipulated by a network of people who had used his ambition and his skill to cover up their own illegal activities. And now, with Marcus in custody, it was time to bring down the rest of them. Martinez was able to extract a list of names from Dune, high-profile individuals who had been involved in the network's operations. There were business tycoons, influential political figures, and powerful celebrities who had been complicit in the trafficking of human flesh. Martinez's mind raced as she processed the information. These weren't just small-time criminals. They were among the most powerful people in the world. But there was a problem. The names Dune provided were just a starting point. The network was vast, and many of these individuals had been carefully protected by layers of power, influence, and money. If Martinez was going to expose them, she would need to act fast and hit them where it hurt: their reputations, their businesses, and their political power. The next few weeks were a blur of covert operations, interviews with other informants, and coordinated raids. Martinez worked with federal agents, international law enforcement, and intelligence agencies to bring down key members of the syndicate. Every move was calculated, every piece of evidence was carefully handled, but the higher they climbed in the investigation, the more dangerous it became. Several arrests were made, but some of the names on the list, men and women with vast resources, managed to slip through the cracks. They used their influence to delay justice, to buy time, and to silence anyone who dared speak out. Martinez knew that she couldn't let up, but with every arrest, the syndicate became more desperate. Then, one day, Martinez received an unexpected call. It was a recording from an anonymous source. A warning. "They know you're coming, detective. You've stirred the hornet's nest. The powerful people behind Marcus Barlow won't stop until you're silenced. Watch your back." The voice was muffled, but the message was clear. Martinez was in grave danger. The more she exposed, the more powerful people had to lose. But she wasn't about to stop. She had come too far, and too many innocent lives had been destroyed for her to back down now. Martinez's next move was bold. She decided to confront one of the most influential figures on the list: Elliot Grayson, the politician who had been tied to Marcus Barlow. Grayson had been a key player in the operation, and despite being behind bars, he still held sway over many of the network's remaining operatives. If she could break him, she could unravel the rest of the syndicate. But when Martinez entered Grayson's cell for the final interrogation, she found a different man than she expected. Gone was the arrogance and confidence that had marked their previous meeting. In its place was a man who seemed broken, defeated, and terrified. "Why did you do it, Grayson?" Martinez asked, her voice steady but stern. Grayson looked up at her, his face gaunt. "You think I wanted any of this? You think I enjoyed it? I was just a pawn, detective. They threatened me, my family. They used me to keep the operation going. I was in too deep." Martinez narrowed her eyes. "You could have walked away. You could have exposed them sooner." "I tried," Grayson muttered, "but they had too many connections, too much power. You have no idea what these people can do. They can make anyone disappear, even you. I'm not proud of what I did, but I was too afraid to say no." Martinez stared at him for a long moment. She could see the fear in his eyes, but she also saw the truth. Grayson had been a puppet for the syndicate, but he had been complicit in the horror for years. The web of power was so deeply entrenched that even the politicians and businessmen who were supposed to serve the people had been bought and manipulated. The system itself was broken, and the victims had paid the price. Martinez had uncovered the names, exposed the criminals, and brought them to justice. But the fight was far from over. There were still others in hiding, still powerful people who had escaped arrest. She had learned that the syndicate was not an isolated operation. It was a global network of corruption, one that reached far beyond Marcus Barlow and his restaurant. But as the investigation continued, Martinez realized that this was a fight for more than just justice. It was a fight to expose a system that had allowed such horrors to flourish for so long, a fight to dismantle the power structures that protected the guilty. The case of Marcus Barlow and his network would go down in history as one of the most disturbing, criminal investigations of the decade. But for Detective Elena Martinez, the victory wasn't in the arrests or the confessions. It was in the lives that had been saved, the people who had been given a voice, and the truth that had finally been brought into the light.